10-second security tip, go.
Cyber incidents are not something we generally look forward to, but they do provide our best opportunity to reflect on the health of our security controls and our business processes. Leverage the incident to influence progress where it's needed.
It's time to begin the CISO Security Vendor Relationship Podcast. Recorded in front of a live audience.
Welcome to the CISO Security Vendor Relationship Podcast. My name is David Spark. I am the host and producer of this show, and I'm here with my co-host, Andy Ellis, who is the operating partner over at Wil Ventures, and we are live in front of an audience, the first one since this pandemic started. We are in Newport, Rhode Island for the Passwordless event. This is actually the Passwordless Summit. Excuse my ignorance there. We are here live at the Passwordless Summit in Newport, Rhode Island. I'm excited to be here. Thank you to HYPR, who is our sponsor, who's brought us all here. And thank you very much, Andy, for coming as well.
Thanks for having me here, David. Nice drive down from Boston.
And same here. I drove down from Boston as well, and we had a little bit of a hiccup just before. A first time I ever saw this. All power went out on my board, and I was actually stepping on the power cord, which...
Usually we blame like the squirrel or the python for doing that, but this is the first time I've had the foot.
The foot, yeah. My foot was literally right on the power cord, so not a good place to put it as well. You have gone to some live events. It is very weird all of a sudden to be at a live event in front of people and talking to people face to face, which prior to all this seemed rather normal, but...
It did, but you know, what I really appreciated was that little bit of familiarity of the table tents. It's like having people's Zoom name underneath them. We in fact have the table tent as sort of the physical space equivalent. It gave me that little bit of comfort that maybe I was really just on Zoom.
Yeah, but I don't think, right now, can you read any of their names from this distance?
I can read one name right here. I can read Joel's name because he's about 4 feet away.
Yeah, but I can't read. I think we got to go for a larger font size in future events. But you know, you learn that from experience. All right, I want to introduce our guest who's going to be here as well, and we're going to jump into it. We do a sort of a supersized show for our live shows, so I'm excited to do this with everybody. Joining us for this conversation, and we got a packed show, is the head of Cyberdefense and Monitoring over at Wells Fargo, Brian Heemsoth. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
David, Andy, thank you for having me, and thank you to the HYPR team for having all of us.
Yes.
What's it going to take to get them motivated?
What are ways to make a good impression about the quality of your security? So Mike Johnson, who's my other co-host of this very show, posted a browser warning that the website he was trying to visit had an expired security certificate. Now the story gets worse than this. It was actually from a security vendor. So there's a good amount of branding and user experience necessary in security to make people feel safe and for them to physically do the right thing, you know, within your site. So I'm going to start with you, Andy, on this. How do you look at your environment for these moments? You know, you want to demonstrate you have a secure environment, and you also want to lead people to take the secure action.
So obviously you never want this to happen, but it does happen. Actually happened to me on my personal website very recently, so I definitely empathize. You know, sometimes setting up the cron job is a little more challenging than you think it is, even with Let's Encrypt out there. So if you get things right, obviously that's a nice seamless experience, but then nobody knows you're doing it. The really important thing is when something like this happens is how did you respond and take action, right? Do you just say, hey, yeah, we screwed this up, we're gonna fix it, and we've implemented some processes, or are you going to do I think the favorite thing some people have done, which is throw the intern under the bus, like never makes a company look good. Because the reality is you didn't set up a process. You can't just blame an intern for the problem. Even though it might feel comforting at that moment, that's like the worst possible thing.
Right, well, you don't want to do that, but I want to actually, and I'm going to throw it to you, Brian, now. I want to talk about, like, where do you find these sort of moments of, like, hey, I think people are getting confused by this, or they're getting uncomfortable here. And I'm assuming just, basic sort of web stats will show you, like, people, like, in the classic case of e-commerce, I can see people abandoning shopping carts because maybe something spooked them, who knows, or sometimes it's just load time causes it to happen. What are those moments you're looking for to make people feel more secure?
Yeah, David, I mean, there's a couple of elements to look at here. First is what's the hygiene of your consumer-facing applications? Because our customers, they read into that, right? If they see cert issues, if they see a user experience that is difficult to navigate, that erodes their trust in your brand. As it relates to the user experience specifically, you are correct, exactly. There's a huge onus on us as technology practitioners to use the information that we have available to us to make sure that our customers are getting the right experience from our sites, to make sure that we provide our services in a way that's able to make them successful in what they're looking to execute with our companies.
Just give me like one classic example of like, this is something that happens all the time, and we do this, we find people's sort of confidence sort of increases.
Well, the greatest example there is a password reset process, right? If you have an onerous, difficult to navigate password reset process, you will have customers that don't trust that process, and therefore they don't trust your brand. Meanwhile, if you have the opposite, if you have collaboration between your digital and your user experience and your security teams to put together a process that helps make the customer successful, allows them to reset a password in this case, they'll be able to be successful. They'll generate more revenue for your company most likely, and they'll have more trust in your brand as an individual.
I think that was a key point actually Jim Ruth brought up in one of the earlier sessions here, was the sort of that frictionless experience needs to be at the top of the list when we're talking about security improvements, because that's what resonates with the rest of the business and with our consumers.
Right, but we all know it doesn't come easy. It's a ton of work to make something seem like it's simple. And so, like, what's some like heavy lifting thing you had to do to make something seem so sort of minutely simple, but the amount of sort of background action was so intense?
So actually for us, when I was at Akamai, we did this. We went to a passwordless model, but it involved every device had a certificate installed on it. We had rolled out 802.1x, which I don't actually recommend for anybody to do that on a wired network. But as a consequence, we had a certificate infrastructure. So for us, when an employee went to a website, like there was this certificate authentication happening that they never saw, and then they got push authentication to their phone, so they felt like they were engaged, but they didn't have to type in a password. But it took us 10 years to roll that out because nobody else had done that when we were doing it. Now it's much easier for people. But sometimes you have to have that vision of where you're trying to get to slowly move in that direction.
Similar case, Brian?
Yeah, I'll provide an example from the customer-facing element. Past company I worked at, we were doing a large deployment of a consumer authentication capability focused on the binding of users to their devices, which is all very complex, right? But we have to be able to offer these services to folks that don't have that level of technical complexity to be able to understand all that. So the key for us came down to choosing technology partners that made that integration seamless and putting those capabilities into our application flows for our customers in a way that made sense to them, that broke down these complex concepts into simple concepts that they could understand, and also have flows and have engagement models that worked very well for those customers. And that was a tough process, right? Many rounds of design, throwing out ideas that we thought were fruitful, but we later learned were not viable through acceptance testing, and finding that right mix that worked for our customer base and their demographics.
Is this a cybersecurity disinformation campaign?
Andy, you enlighten me to the absurd restrictions companies have in their end user license agreements, or EULAs. Now, according to research from the Transparency in Cybersecurity, an organization you co-founded, a whopping 42% of companies out of 200 you sampled have clauses that in some fashion restrict reviewing their products, or at least need approval to publish a review. Many even said you couldn't pen test their product. So my first reaction to this is, isn't this a blatant violation of free speech? And has any company you know acted on this clause since security products have been reviewed and many have not been favorable?
So I think from a principle of free speech, ignoring First Amendment, which is an implementation, it's absolutely a violation of the principles of free speech. Now, there are communities where you might have things like the Chatham House Rule, where you, as a community, decide you're not going to name somebody who said something. But this certainly wouldn't fit into that framework. There's certainly confidentiality agreements that people could have. Again, this really doesn't fit into that framework. The big challenge that we've seen is we have seen people act on this, and even if it's not legally enforceable, that's okay. They have big pockets. They throw lawyers at you, and unless you're willing to stand up and fight their lawyers and take that stand, then you're most likely just going to go away quietly.
Brian, before you read this, by the way, I didn't even know this existed. Did you even know this existed prior to this?
I will admit I did not.
And this just seems astonishing to me. I mean, do you see the sort of why I called this a cybersecurity disinformation campaign is you see where this could lead, if it has not already led already, that you're not going to get legitimate reviews of software you need to see if they're squashing negative reviews.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors here. One is that part of the interest that these vendors have is making sure that they're protecting their intellectual property, right? There are certain ways that the product works that they really don't want to get out there into the public domain, and I absolutely understand that. For us as consuming companies, our ability here is to know what we're signing, right? Have your security teams read the agreements, have your legal teams read the agreements, parse through them, make sure that you're going to be able to get out of those agreements what you need to be able to be successful with that product. Can you measure success? Can you assure that it's working well in your environment? Can you collect the information that you need prior to implementation and deployment to assure that you'll be successful in doing that? And then let your wallet do the talking, right? If you can't come to an agreement that you feel will work with a given vendor, find another one.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, Orca Security just got a cease and desist letter recently.
Yeah,
What's the story? Can you tell us?
Yeah, so Orca, which is one of the companies in the Weil portfolio, and so I do a lot of work with them. So Orca actually did, they said, let's test our product against competitor products, and we'll just post a review. And the review was literally like, here's a video of watching what's on the screen so you can see what got detected and what didn't get detected. This seems like something that anybody who was a user of these products could get to.
Good old-fashioned benchmark test.
And so Palo Alto sent them a cease and desist letter that said, you have to take this down because our EULA says you're not allowed to do a review, and this is a review. Now, what's interesting is a lot of these companies, and I think Palo Alto is one of them, have reviews that are favorable that they publish, but they just don't want negative reviews.
Yeah, well, and this comes the problem of, if this were to be true, and like all organizations did this, you would never see a negative review of a cybersecurity product.
Absolutely.
And so that would speak very well for us here in the industry that we're all doing an amazing job.
Our products worked amazingly well, and the only reason that security isn't perfect is because we don't want it to be.
So I had a similar story to this where I did some work for a company called Rokana, a small little company that was writing some negative things about Splunk. And Splunk, which had a history of going after small companies with some legal muscle, sent a cease and desist order to them. They were actually named me in the cease and desist order. And Rokana just sort of stood up to them and said, no, we're not going to fall, because they claimed that some of the things that they said in a white paper and things that I had written were false statements. And they essentially were claiming slander, or whatever the legal term was at the time. And so Rokana stood up to them. They didn't back down, and they actually published the cease and desist letter.
Yep.
And it went public, and a lot of negative press came on to Splunk, and they bought themselves a lot of negative press. The fast forward, the end of the story is Splunk ended up buying Rokana, which I always find a little amusing to it all. But this also, I mean, in this perfect case is, big companies can squash little companies.
Absolutely.
I mean, if this were to hold.
Well, it's not even the little companies. It's also the individuals. Imagine if you have a security researcher who's using the product and they're like, hey, I just want to write a review so that other researchers know how to best use the product, what use cases it doesn't work for. These companies aren't necessarily really going after their employer, except as a way of pushing down onto that individual. So the person who's most at risk are the individual practitioners whose employment might be at risk because their general counsel just got a cease and desist letter and is like, I don't want to deal with this. They didn't pick a fight. It was just the reviewer. And so that's who I'm really most worried about, is the individuals who have the knowledge we want, that they know how well these products work and where to best use them, are keeping their mouths shut because there's this chilling effect from these EULAs.
Who's our sponsor this week?
It's HYPR. Who would have thunk? Yes, we're here. They're the passwordless company, and they're sponsoring this entire event we're having in Newport, Rhode Island. Now, HYPR is the leader in passwordless multi-factor authentication, or MFA, as we all know. We protect workforce and customer identities with the highest level of assurance while enhancing the end user's experience. Our approach shifts the economics of attack and risk in the enterprise's favor by replacing password-based MFA with passwordless MFA. With HYPR, customers can finally enable cross-platform desktop MFA, stop phishing, and reduce fraud associated with weak or stolen passwords. Now, passwords and shared secrets continue to be the primary cause of breaches and user frustration. Despite investment in multi-factor authentication, your workforce and customers still log in with password-based MFA every day. This means it's essentially single-factor authentication. True passwordless MFA makes the attacker go after each device individually. Your attack surface that was once expensive to defend now becomes expensive to attack. By reimagining identity security, you change the economics of an attack, improve your security posture, and enhance digital engagement with every login experience. Welcome to the Passwordless Company. It's time to reimagine identity security.
It's time to play What's Worse?
All right, for those of you who have heard our podcast, this is the most popular segment of the show, so we're going to play it twice. We have 2 rounds of this game, and the game, What's Worse, is essentially what it sounds like. I'm going to create offer up 2 scenarios. They are always submitted by listeners of the podcast, and you'll get 2 scenarios. They are both going to be horrible, all right? You're not going to like either one of them. The game here is, and I'm going to ask for your vote via applause here as well. The goal here is to figure out which one is worse. So it's a risk management exercise of, all right, one of these is going to cause more damage more quickly, more often than the other. All right, are you ready?
I'm
Andy?
ready.
I always make Andy.
And I don't know what these are, so I haven't seen them.
These are all surprises. These are all surprises. And Andy, I always make him answer first. So Brian, you get a little more time to think. And by the way, I always like it when you disagree with the host. No pressure.
I'll try my best.
All right. So this first one comes from Nir Rothenberg, who is the CISO of Rapid, and I'm going to also say it was also inspired by Shahar Maor, who's the CISO over at Fiverr. So 2 people to credit for this one. Okay, you push, Andy, to get this very significant security bug fixed, but leave the development team hating you in the process, all right? It was a big push for it. Or you completely delay the fix, but keep a good working relationship with the dev team. What's worse?
Oh, this one's easy. The first one is absolutely worse. The second one is a fantastic approach. I actually don't think it's a bad approach because what it does is it incentivizes the development team to continue to work with you in the future. At Akamai, I had a rule. If the development team found a really awful bug, they got to set the timeline for it within reason so that they would be incentivized to tell me as soon as they had found it.
All right, I like that answer. And you think the first one's so bad because?
The first one is really bad because you might get it fixed today, but it will slow down every single other thing you have to do. And security is a marathon. We're not just trying to fix one thing, it's thousands of things.
All right. Now, I throw this to you, Brian. Which one's worse? You can agree or disagree with Andy here.
You know, as much as I would like to disagree with Andy, I'm going to have to agree with him here, right? So you have a situation where you might, with the first scenario, you fix that bug, you're golden, right? You can go home that night, you can sleep well and say, we're in great shape. If you lose that team, the issues that will manifest themselves in the coming weeks, coming months, coming releases will dwarf what you had success on up front, and you'll pay the price much more significantly in the end. All
right, good answers. Now I'm going to ask for applause for this. How many people think the the one that they said is the actual worst option of the two. So that was get that bug fixed, but have this developer team hating you. Yes, applaud? Yes? It seems like it's pretty much everyone in this room. Anyone think the other one is worse about delay the fix and keep a good relationship with the dev team? Nobody thinks? You what? Two brave souls. Two. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Did you applaud for both though? I did not. Okay, good. I appreciate that. All right. All right. Whoops. Let me turn that off. All right. Now here's the second one, and very appropriate for today's conference, the Passwordless Summit. So this came in actually a conversation with Jason Dance, who's with Greenwich Associates. Here are the two bad situations. You have no multi-factor authentication, but you've got unique passwords. Everyone's got a unique password. It's a good long
unique from each other or unique from any other password they use anywhere? Let's go for the latter one because I'm hoping the former one's assumed.
I'm going to say you don't know. You don't know that second one. It's okay. It's unique from each other. You have no idea if they use it in other locations, okay? You just don't know. So no MFA, but unique passwords. Versus SMS MFA with the same password across all.
I think I'm going to go with the first one is worse. Because at the end of the day, I'm relying on a static password that can get compromised in any number of fashions. Whereas with the SMS, yes, I do have the issue of adversaries who can clone SMS cards and get involved in there, but at least I've got some piece of interactivity. But I got to say, both of these are truly awful.
They are truly bad.
So it's a really good selection of actually getting two really awful ones.
They are okay. So you think no MFA but unique passwords is the worst option. Brian, agree or disagree on this one?
So as a security practitioner, this really hurts my soul because these are two truly terrible options. I will actually disagree with Andy, though.
Okay, good.
I believe that if you're in a situation where you have unique and strong passwords as opposed to the opposite, where you have reliance on a defeatable multi-factor mechanism, you probably have a still bad, but actually superior security model than what you'd have with the opposite.
All right. Now, I want you to know that I, at one time, worked for a company where literally and this predates the internet, or our use of the internet, let me say that, predates our use of the internet, and every single person at the company had the same exact password, and that was the name of the IT guy, which was Manny.
I love that it's the name of the IT guy. It's not even just like some random thing.
No.
But I actually look at it that when you think about the case where they all have the same password, just assume they don't have a password and you're just doing SMS-based login. And in reality, a lot of us have that with places where like, oh, I don't remember my password. I do a reset, and they text you a code and you log in. So that's basically all that is.
All right. I want to get the audience reaction. Okay. All right. By applause, again, it's what is the worst of the two scenarios. By applause, no MFA, but unique passwords across all. Is that the worst? I'm going to go with about a third to, about a half the room. Okay. Worse is SMS MFA with the same password across all.
Pretty close.
I think we got to split.
Yeah, I think I saw a 1/3 split there, and 1/3 were like not participating because they did not want to be on the record as picking either of those awful approaches.
Please, enough. No, more.
All right, today's topic is using passwords and MFA for identity. We just talked about that and what's worse. It is universally known and accepted that a password-only access system is fraught with problems. I think there's pretty much universal agreement in this very room itself. But at the same time, other non-password authentication systems are little known, difficult to get adoption, and as a result are not nearly as widespread as just passwords. So Andy, it's called Please Enough, No More. What have you heard enough about password and MFA authentication systems, and what would you like to hear a lot more?
I think that I have heard enough of Password Plus. That we talk so much about MFA, and it's like, oh, you have a password, and then we're going to add this SMS or this other thing on top of it, and that's not an integrated authentication system. So what I want to hear about is integrated authentication systems. I actually don't like passwords. pretty much been on the record for that one. So integrated without password is fantastic, but how does it work end to end so that you truly know that the user is who you want them to be? Like, that's what I want to know more about. I don't need to hear it's MFA because it's a password plus a thing.
But it is, I'll just say this, password plus a thing is better than just a password, as we all agree at that.
Well, sure, because a password is nothing, so it's really just a thing at that point. Like, we keep, in fact, here's what I want to hear. I don't want to hear MFA ever again. If I could possibly hear that, I just want to hear passwordless. Because I want rid of the concept of multi-factor. I want an integrated authentication system that does not rely on a secret that gets sent over the network. That's what I'm looking for.
All right, I'm throwing this to you, Brian. Start with, what have you heard enough about with passwords and MFA, and what would you like to hear a lot more?
I definitely have heard enough about the authenticator experience, right? Here's your token, here's your push, here's how you're going to log on, but more focus is needed, on the contrary, on how do we make individuals successful with those mechanisms, right? Often the implementations that we see today for MFA are very kludgy, right? I happen to work for a company where we use one of the common token authentication platforms, and I came down here for the weekend and I forgot my token, which means I've got a laptop and I can't possibly do anything with it unless I drive 90 miles home. Meanwhile, what I'd like to see is increased focus, increased adoption on that workforce experience or that customer experience, making people successful, understanding what experience they need in order to be able to do that, and using capabilities like FIDO to deliver a superior security solution, but also superior user experience, and therefore a more successful workforce and more successful customer.
Close your eyes and visualize the perfect engagement.
Over on the cybersecurity subreddit, a Redditor asks, what does a good SOC, a security operations center, look like? In the comments, there was a lot of advice on types of monitoring, what the L1 to L3 technicians do, training and rotation of responsibilities. I'm eager for your feedback on that, but first I'm interested in what the makeup of the SOC is to actually achieve the end result. So I'm going to start with you, Andy. In what priority are you designing your SOC for quick detection, quick remediation, customer service, and preventative security?
It's really hard to separate in those four, and I think every SOC is going to be a little bit different. To me, the most important thing is actually the learning. So every SOC, you have to be able to know for each person, who do they escalate to once they can't quickly solve a problem? But then more importantly, how do they learn back from that escalation? Too many SOCs are one way. The tier one tries to answer it, but when they can't answer it, they just throw it over the wall and they forget about it, and they don't get the opportunity to learn so that they can more quickly remediate and provide better customer service. But certainly, I think customer service drives all of these, is how are you making sure that the customers, whether they're internal or external, know what's happening, know when to expect the next communication, understand what happened, and understand what you're going to do to prevent this specific thing from happening to them again.
Just any kind of fast triage unit as well. Brian, how do you kind of look at sort of the design and development of the SOC?
Yeah, there's really three elements that you look at there, right? You look at the people element, which includes having the right people in the role, having them trained in a way that enables the continuous development of their skills for their own personal development endeavors, as well as the skills that you need them to learn. You look at your technology strategy. Do you have the right tools implemented across your environment to be able to prevent the threats that you can prevent outright, and then a detection strategy that's based around the remainder, right? Detect the things that you can actually prevent from happening. And then finally, the focus on the outcomes that you're driving with your security operations center. So security events are going to happen, security incidents are going to happen. The key to success there is making the most out of those, making those into positive events when they do actually take place, right? Taking your lessons learned and saying, you know what, where did we kill it here, and where are we struggling, right? Do we have a security control that we can make better? Is there a business process that's flawed? Is there a technology stack that we should take a look at and do a threat model against, and enact corrective actions to take advantage of all of those opportunities to get better?
Have you seen the SOC drastically change, let's just say the past 5 years?
I think it depends on the organization, but I've certainly seen a lot more sort of scale needs within SOCs, and I think that's a place where there's an opportunity for improvement. I think we're often throwing bodies at solutions because our technologies aren't adequate, right? They're driven by how many alerts can we show you? I'm reminded of, I think it was IBM had a famous report that came out that showed like how many alerts there were, and I'm thinking, that's exactly the opposite of what we want, right? We want as few alerts as possible. Right. And so I think we're seeing SOCs are on this upswing of getting larger and larger, running into these talent shortages. And I think what we need to see is actually SOCs getting smaller so that they can focus on meaningful problems rather than just like button clicking of, oh, you've seen that alert a dozen times.
Well, getting smaller, and I'm going to throw this to you, Brian. I mean, the volume of alerts come in, and I liken this problem to the problem of information overload, which we hear this story over and over and over again. And the reason we keep, Clay Shirky was the one who had mentioned years ago that we've heard the story of information overload from the moment the Gutenberg press came out, because when that came out, that was the first time more stuff could be printed than the human could consume in a lifetime. So we've always had this problem. But he argued it's always a case of a filter breaking down. So my feeling is it's just, either it's not set right or we've got new technologies that need to be created to create better filters. What have you run into?
Yeah, I mean, the bright side is that visibility into our environments is better than it's ever been, right? We have network tools that tell us everything that's going on our networks. We have endpoint tools that record every button click, every process execution, everything that takes place. The burden that creates is 10, 12, 20 times more data than we had flowing into our data systems 10 years ago. And what that means for us as security practitioners is we can't just throw people at this, like you said, Andy. We have to adopt modern approaches to solve modern problems, right? So for me, that means responsibly and effectively integrating artificial intelligence and machine learning into our data analytics capabilities and using those competencies to help identify the security events that we really need human analyst attention on. Similarly, so much of what goes on in a lot of SOCs today is very repeat. It's button click, button click, button click, log into this portal, pull this email from an inbox, put a proxy block in place. That a lot of those steps can be automated. And if you really peel back, you do an inventory of what your analysts are spending their time on, you'll probably find that 50, 60, 70% of their time is spent doing relatively routine activities. So if you automate that, which is generally in the realm of possibility now with the APIs that the products give us, you'll find that you yield significant resource savings that you can then apply to more advanced threats, right? Threat hunting in your environment, looking for those indicators of compromise that really require deep human analysis, and you've got the capacity to be able to investigate those now.
It's time for the audience question speed round.
All right, Andy, Brian, I have collected some questions from our guests. And actually, I wrote some questions that came up in the sessions or things that I thought of that were sort of inspired by the sessions we just had. So I'm going to give me your best and fastest answers, and let's see how many we can get through with the little bit of time we have remaining. I got about 6 or so questions here. All right, here we go. This comes from Jim Routh. He's board member, advisor, former CISO. He's retired, but he's still got his hand very much in cybersecurity. Here we go. Authentication is on a spectrum from password, just single old password, all the way to continuous authentication. How do enterprises choose where to be on that continuum, on that spectrum? Andy.
How do they choose? I think they need to choose based on the risk of the activity that's going on. And I think you want to be in a place where every connection has at least identity-based authentication, that you know that for this session, this is really coming from David's laptop. But then I think you also have to look at very sensitive things. Do you want to have some form of ceremony or behavioral-based authentication to say, is this something this person ought to be doing right now? Oh, look, they're in Russia in the middle of the night where they were up in Kansas in the middle of the day. They shouldn't be doing this right now.
All right. What would you say to this?
I actually agree. It comes down to the use case, right? So for something like an online user portal with a high likelihood of fraud risk, you absolutely want that behavioral approach to authentication, right? Making sure that the user is authentic, making sure their device is authentic, and that the interactions that are taking place are not malicious. Other use cases, a decentralized authentication function, maybe a little bit more of a point-in-time approach, may be appropriate for the threat model for that application.
All right, let's jump through these. This is just for you, Brian. This comes from Boyan Simic, who is the CEO over at HYPR. And as I understand that Jim Routh has been a significant mentor to you, yes?
He's been all right over the years.
He's been all right. All right. Here's what I want to know. Brian, what's the most critical thing you've learned from Jim?
So when I first met Jim, I was a craft beer guy. And I remember the first time I went to dinner with Jim, I got a comment along the lines of, well, we don't really drink beer at dinners like this, Brian. We drink wine. And that started many years of teaching about all I know of old world and new world wine, which is maybe not much, not on Jim's level yet, but I certainly know a whole lot more than I did.
All right. All right. Now, Boyan had put up a word cloud of the executive order for the nation's cybersecurity. And here's one thing that I noticed. The biggest word on that screen was secure, meaning that was the word that was used the most in the executive order. But literally, I think in the E of that, in the tiniest font of that word cloud, was the word risk. So, I'll start with you, Andy. Does the government not understand that it is a risk management exercise, what you're doing? Or does the public not want to think the government is going to manage their risk?
I think it's a little bit orthogonal, but close to the first one. But I think the challenge is that when we write these standards, or really we have people write them, we invite people into the room to write the standards. Most of them want to write a standard that's going to push their specific solution, whether it's EDR or zero trust. I maintain that the best written law around security remains GLBA, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, because it basically said, know what your risks are, know who's responsible for fixing them, and to have a reasonable plan to deal with it. And that's basically it. It's like 4 paragraphs. And yet we look at our financial services industry, and they have basically led because we told them it's a risk management exercise. Everything else is, here's a list of 1 million things to do, and we seem to fail at doing the basics and those 1 million things. So yeah, I think it's the first. The government doesn't understand risk management.
Do you think the government does not have a clue about risk management? Because I just can't think, like, people think of the government or the police or any of the military, they're securing us, they're not managing our risk.
So the concept and the support for prudent risk management is there, right? Anyone that works in a regulated industry and has interactions with regulators on a regular basis can tell you that, because we see it every day. The challenge that is uncovered when you try to put together cybersecurity legislation, particularly types of legislation that this type of legislation that's aimed to provide guidance for technical teams and for organizations, it's difficult to toe that line between risk management and providing guidance in a way that can actually be implemented by organizations at various levels of maturity and sophistication. So I think generally the way to attack that tends to be to lean towards, well, here are the security requirements that you have to have.
Good point. All right, we're going to close with this one. I'm going to start with you, Brian, on this. So Ed Amoroso's had a very pro SBOM, which is the software bill of materials. Ed works for TAG Cyber, and I want to know what your feeling is about this whole thing of that vendors need to reveal essentially their ingredients, if you will, Brian.
I think the more important element here is actually that the activity takes place. So we did have some great conversation here this morning on this topic exactly. As a leader from an organization with a large volume of third parties, when I look at Acme Corp or third party A, it's important for me to know that they have the right controls in their software development lifecycle to know what they're developing, to make sure it's free of vulnerabilities, rather than they give me a 7-mile long list of everything that they've put in their application, because what am I really going to do with that effectively at scale, right? So again, it's much more important that we have that validation that the right activities are taking place to develop that software bill of materials, and more importantly, to take action to risk assess and to mitigate risks as identified through that process.
Yeah, and Andy, I know that you sort of snapped back at the whole SBOM concept, and it infuriated you, but there was a level of agreement that Brian sort of came to here.
Absolutely. I'm opposed to the public publishing of SBOMs, but I'm a firm believer in understanding what's in your own software development lifecycle and what you're dealing with. The challenge SBOMs have is software isn't food, and the ingredients model doesn't work, especially not in the software as a service world, where your ingredient equivalent would be like going to a restaurant and ordering food and asking them what the personal hygiene products were of the driver of the truck that had brought in some of their food 3 weeks ago. Like, that's the level of detail that SBOMs are pushing towards in the software as a service world. And that's hard for somebody to even consume, let alone to create and grasp that data.
All right, well, we're looking forward to knowing what deodorant you used today.
Old Spice.
And that brings us to the end of our podcast. I want to thank our guest, Brian Heemsoth, who is with Wells Fargo, and my guest, Andy Ellis. And I also have to thank HYPR and this awesome event here in Rhode Island. So thank you so much, and thank our audience for very much coming here. While it's a small and powerful audience, and we greatly appreciate you being here. All right, for closing comments here, Brian, I'll let you have the last word. And by the way, I always ask our guests, are you hiring? So make sure you have an answer to that question. Any last thoughts, Andy?
So I think we're at this cusp moment in a lot of different things. We've talked about passwordless, we've talked about SBOMs, and I think it's really important for us all to design for our next wave of security and to aim for simplicity over complexity. That's going to be my plug for today.
I like it. Brian.
Well, first, thank you to the HYPR team for having us here in Rhode Island. It's been a great weekend, a lot of great conversation, and a lot of forward-thinking folks looking to solve passwordless challenges across a wide variety of use cases. So I'm super excited to see that. And of course, we are hiring. Head out to wellsfargo.com/careers and search for information security.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank to HYPR, I thank to the crowd as well, and I thank our audience, as always, for their contributions and listening to the CISO Security Vendor Relationship Podcast.